In every love story told across time, there's usually a hero and a villain. But what if the tale you thought you knew about a kidnapped spring goddess and the morally grey Dark Lord who stole her was more complicated? This is the story of how the world gained its seasons through an unlikely mixture of administrative reform, pomegranate-related contract law, and two deities who found love in the space between light and shadow. Before we begin, please comment where you are and what time it is so we can see who's joining us from around the world. It's fascinating to discover where you are tuning in from. Now close your eyes, sink into the covers, take a deep breath and release it, relaxing your face, shoulders and the rest of your body. Let your thoughts slow, and let this very old tale carry you gently into slumber. In the beginning, before winter existed, the world knew only warmth. No falling leaves marked the passing of time, no frost traced patterns on morning windows, and humans had yet to learn the art of complaining about the weather. The earth remained caught in an endless dance of growth and bloom, each day as golden as the one before. This was the world Persephone knew. As daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, she lived in a realm of perpetual springtime, where flowers turned to follow her steps, and young plants strained toward her touch like children reaching for comfort. She moved through meadows with a kind of grace that comes from never having known fear or sorrow, her laughter carrying on warm breezes, and her presence making even the most modest daisy stand a little taller. But even in this age of endless summer, shadows existed. They belonged to Hades, lord of the underworld, who ruled his dark realm with quiet efficiency and a surprising amount of paperwork. His kingdom wasn't evil, just perpetually understaffed and chronically underfunded. The dead, as it turned out, were terrible at paying taxes. Hades himself was not what most would expect from a god of the dead. He was, in fact, rather orderly, the type of immortal who kept meticulous records and probably invented filing systems in his spare time. He ran his kingdom like a particularly well-organised office, though admittedly one with more rivers of fire than your average workplace. Between these two realms, the sun-dappled meadows above and the torchlit halls below, stood Demeter, Persephone's mother. And Demeter had rules. Not guidelines, not suggestions. Rules. The kind written in stone and underlined twice. Chief among them, her daughter was to remain in the light, untouched by darkness, forever. The Fates, those weavers of destiny, must have smiled when they heard this decree. They knew, as immortals should have learned by now, that nothing invites change quite like someone insisting things must stay the same forever. And so our story truly begins on a day like any other, when Persephone walked barefoot through her mother's fields, trailing her fingers through tall grass and singing softly to the nodding flowers. She was, as always, surrounded by nymphs, her mother's idea of an ancient Greek security detail. But even watchful nymphs can be distracted, and Persephone's attention had been caught by something new. A flower she had never seen before, a narcissus blooming alone in a patch of sunlight. Meanwhile, deep below the earth, Hades looked up from his eternal ledgers. For the first time in centuries he felt something shift in the careful order of his world. Through the layers of earth and stone, through the very roots of existence, he sensed her presence above, and everything changed. Perhaps we should pause here to properly understand Demeter's particular brand of maternal devotion. This wasn't your ordinary mother's worry. This was divine helicopter parenting elevated to an art form. Every morning, Demeter would personally arrange the sunbeams that would touch her daughter's face. She crafted each meadow Persephone walked through, testing the grass for softness, interrogating suspicious-looking rocks, and conducting thorough background checks on every butterfly that dared to flutter too close. The nymphs who attended Persephone had been selected through a vetting process that would make royal bodyguards seem casual. Each one had sworn sacred oaths not just to protect the young goddess, but to report back every detail of her day, who she spoke to, which flowers she favoured, whether she'd shown any dangerous interest in the world beyond her mother's carefully curated gardens. And the other gods? They weren't even allowed in the same zip code. Apollo had once made the mistake of suggesting that perhaps the young goddess might enjoy attending one of Olympus's monthly mixers. The resulting agricultural crisis had caused 3 minor famines before he managed to stammer out an apology. Persephone bore all this attention with the patient grace of someone who had never known anything else. She loved her mother, of course. How could she not? Demeter's love was as constant as the sun, as nurturing as rain, as overwhelming as a flood. But lately, something had begun to stir in her heart. Questions like stubborn weeds took root in her mind. What lay beyond the endless summer? What secrets did shadows hold? What did it feel like to make a choice that was truly entirely her own? She never spoke these thoughts aloud, but sometimes, when she was alone, or as alone as her mother's watchful nymphs would allow, she would find herself drawn to the darker blooms in her garden, the deep purple irises, the midnight blue delphiniums. She would catch herself wondering about the places where sunlight didn't reach, about the mysteries that lurked beneath the earth's surface. It was on one such day of wondering that she spotted the narcissus. It stood alone, impossibly perfect, its white petals almost luminous against the dark soil. Later, many would say it was a trap, planted there by Hades himself. Others would claim it was the fates' design, a single flower wielding the power to change the world. But in that moment, Persephone thought nothing of destiny or divine schemes. She only saw a flower she had never encountered in all her years of wandering her mother's realm. And for the first time in her life, she did something unprecedented. She slipped away from her watchful attendants, drawn by an urge she couldn't explain, to pluck a bloom her mother hadn't planted. Above her, the sun continued to shine with unchanging brightness. Below her, the lord of the underworld set aside his eternal ledgers, his heart beating with unfamiliar urgency. And somewhere in between, Demeter was about to learn that even the most carefully tended gardens can harbour unexpected growth. The narcissus swayed gently, despite there being no breeze. Later, scholars would debate whether this was an ominous warning, or simply flowers doing what flowers do when reality is about to crack open. Either way, Persephone reached for it, her fingers just brushing the stem. The ground split. Not with the polite restraint of a normal earthquake, mind you. This was theatrical, dramatic. The kind of entrance that would have inspired thousands of brooding romantic heroes millennia later. The earth didn't just open, it performed. And there was Hades. Now history has painted him in various shades of villain, but let's be honest, he was more complicated than that. Tall, pale as moonlight, with eyes that held the depths of eternity. He looked exactly like someone who had spent several thousand years perfecting the art of being mysteriously attractive, while also being absolutely terrible at normal social interaction. His chariot was crafted from shadows and pulled by horses made of darkness itself, the kind of ride that would make future Gothic aesthetics look like a child's crayon drawing. He had clearly put some thought into this moment, though whether that made it better or worse was debatable. Persephone, for her part, didn't scream. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She looked interested. This was not part of the plan. The plan, if you could dignify Hades' impulse decision with such a word, had accounted for fear, shock, maybe even outrage. It had not accounted for the spring goddess looking at his dramatic entrance the way one might look at a particularly intriguing puzzle. Their eyes met across the chasm of broken earth. Time held its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a nymph finally noticed something was wrong and began to shriek, but it was already too late. Hades reached out his hand, pale, elegant, definitely not trembling, and spoke the first words that would change everything. "Your mother," he said, with the kind of dry understatement that suggested he was very aware of exactly how bad this idea was, is going to be absolutely furious about this. And Persephone, daughter of eternal summer, goddess of all things bright and growing, did the unthinkable. She laughed. What happened next would be told differently depending on who you asked. The nymphs would swear it was a violent kidnapping. Demeter would describe it as theft, pure and simple. Zeus would later diplomatically call it a non-traditional courtship strategy. But the truth, as always, lived somewhere in the complicated shadows between these versions. Hades lifted Persephone into his chariot with the careful precision of someone handling a particularly explosive flower. "I should probably explain," he started, in the tone of someone who had definitely not practiced this speech in front of his mirror for weeks. But explanation time would have to wait, because the ground was already sealing itself above them as they plunged into darkness. The last thing Persephone saw was sunlight splintering into fragments as the earth knit itself back together, erasing their escape route like a secret being swept under a cosmic rug. Now, here's where our morally grey protagonist shows his true colours, because Hades, Lord of the Dead, most powerful of the chthonic deities, keeper of souls and master of the underworld, was having a panic attack. "I have a palace," he said quickly as they hurtled through the darkness. "And gardens. Different kinds of gardens. Dark ones, but still gardens. And a library. 3 libraries, actually. And a very competitive benefits package for all employees, including dental." He paused. "I'm not selling this well, am I?" Persephone, still clutching her Narcissus, looked at him with an expression caught somewhere between amusement and disbelief. "Did you just kidnap me by offering me dental insurance?" "I also have dogs," he added helpfully. "Well, dog. Technically 3 dogs in one body. It's complicated." This was not perhaps the smooth criminal mastermind the stories would later paint him as. Instead, here was a god who ran the most efficient supernatural bureaucracy in existence, who had single-handedly created the world's first functional justice system for souls, who treated his subjects with more fairness than any Olympian deity, and who had just committed felony kidnapping because he had no idea how to ask someone on a date. The chariot burst into the underworld proper, and Persephone got her first look at Hades' realm. It was different. Where her mother's world was all soft edges and gentle light, this place was sharp angles and deep shadows. Rivers glowed with strange lights. Crystal formations cast prismatic reflections across obsidian walls, and in the distance, a palace of black marble rose like a geometry teacher's fever dream. "It's not all darkness," Hades said quickly, misreading her fascinated expression for horror. There are different shades of darkness, and some very interesting phosphorescent fungi, and the Elysian fields are quite nice actually, very pastoral. The heroic dead are excellent landscapers." He was rambling now, this powerful god who judged the souls of the dead but apparently couldn't judge the appropriate way to court a goddess. Yet there was something endearing about his awkward honesty, something compelling about a deity who could command legions of the dead, but got flustered trying to make small talk. Persephone looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the villain of her mother's warnings, but something far more interesting. A god who had created order from chaos, who offered fair judgment to all souls regardless of their earthly status, who treated his subjects with a justice that Olympus had never managed to achieve. A god who was, perhaps, as trapped by his role as she had been by hers. "Show me," she said suddenly, cutting off his ongoing list of underworld amenities. "Show you? Everything. The rivers, the fields, the judgment halls. Show me your realm." Her eyes glittered with something that might have been defiance, or might have been destiny. "Show me what's worth getting kidnapped for." And Hades, who had expected resistance or tears or rage, who had prepared for every reaction except genuine interest, did something that would shock all of Olympus. He smiled. The tour of the underworld began, appropriately enough, at the gates. Not the famous ones with all the doom and gloom warnings. Those were for mortal souls. No, Hades led Persephone through a smaller side entrance, the immortal equivalent of showing someone your private collection. "This," he said, gesturing to a shimmering waterfall of shadows, "is where new souls arrive. His voice took on the quiet pride of someone showing off a particularly well-organised filing system. Each one is registered, categorised and directed to their appropriate afterlife destination. "You process every single human soul?" Persephone asked, watching the endless stream of spirits. "Personally." There was no boasting in his tone, just simple fact. Everyone deserves a fair judgment. As they moved through his kingdom, Persephone began to notice things the stories never mentioned. How the palace staff, shades who had chosen to serve in death, smiled when they saw him coming. How he knew each of his guards by name, asking after their eternal families. How even Cerberus, that fearsome three-headed hound, acted more like an oversized puppy in his presence. The gardens of the underworld were nothing like her mother's sunny meadows. Here, crystals grew like flowers, their facets catching and multiplying the light of eternal flames. Luminous fungi created constellations along dark walls, and strange silver-leafed plants thrived in the gentle glow of underground rivers. "It's beautiful," she said, touching a crystal formation that chimed softly under her fingers. Different, but beautiful. Hades watched her with an expression that suggested he was seeing his realm anew through her eyes. Most find it unsettling. Most people are afraid of different. She turned to him, head tilted thoughtfully. "Is that why you stay down here? Because it's easier than dealing with their fear?" He blinked, caught off guard by her insight. "I have responsibilities." "That's not an answer." "No," he admitted, "it's not." They passed through the Elysian fields, where hero souls played eternal games under stars that never existed. Through Asphodel, where ordinary souls drifted in peaceful contentment, even past the edges of Tartarus, though Hades hurried them by that particular neighbourhood with a mumbled, "terrible property values there." In his library, Persephone discovered scrolls containing the story of every soul that had ever lived. In his judgment hall, she watched him listen to each shade's tale with patience and wisdom. In his private study, she found detailed plans for improving the afterlife system, notes on making the transition easier for frightened souls. You actually care about them, she realised. The mortals. You're not just processing souls, you're taking care of them. "Someone should," he said quietly. "They lived their lives as best they could. They deserve peace in death, at least." Standing there in his study, surrounded by evidence of millennia spent working to perfect his realm, Persephone saw Hades clearly. Not a villain, not a hero, but something far more interesting. A god who had carved out his own path between light and shadow, between duty and compassion. "So," she said, picking up one of his scrolls, "tell me more about these improvement plans of yours." And for the first time since she'd arrived, Hades relaxed completely, because this, finally, was a conversation he knew how to have. Meanwhile, above ground, things were getting apocalyptic. Demeter had progressed through the 5 stages of grief in approximately 30 seconds, skipped straight to rage, and invented several new stages that primarily involved killing every plant in a 100-mile radius. The eternal spring she had maintained since the dawn of creation was rapidly transforming into the world's first winter, and nobody was prepared for it. Mortals watched in confusion as their crops shriveled overnight. Tree leaves turned strange colours and began jumping to their deaths. The ground frosted over like nature itself was having a cold sweat. Humans, who had never experienced weather below 70 degrees, suddenly had to invent both sleeves and complaining about the weather. "Persephone!" Demeter's voice echoed across continents, causing several minor avalanches and at least one volcanic eruption. She stormed across the earth, her footsteps leaving trails of withered vegetation and frozen soil. Every nymph in her daughter's entourage had been temporarily transformed into various uncomfortable plant forms, mostly cacti, which was Demeter's way of saying, "You had one job." Up on Olympus, the other gods were having an emergency meeting. Well, trying to. It's hard to have a proper crisis management session when half the participants are attempting to look innocent while quietly placing bets on how long Hades would survive once found. Zeus sat on his throne nursing a migraine and what appeared to be his fourth cup of ambrosia. "Let me get this straight," he said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "My brother, king of the underworld, lord of the dead, just grabbed our sister's daughter and disappeared into the earth?" Hermes, who had been sent to investigate and had returned looking slightly singed from Demeter's rage, nodded. "Through a crack in the ground. Very dramatic. Lots of black horses and shadow effects. Honestly, I'd give the aesthetics a solid 9 out of 10. "Not helping Hermes," Athena muttered. Apollo, still bitter about the previous famine incident, couldn't help adding, "Well, maybe if someone hadn't been so overprotective." "Finish that sentence," Artemis cut in, "and I'll tell Demeter you knew about this." Apollo shut up so fast he almost swallowed his laurel wreath. "The mortals are starting to panic," Athena reported, ever practical. "They've never seen plants die before. Some of them are trying to bargain with their vegetables." "And Demeter?" Zeus asked, though he clearly didn't want to know the answer. "She's turned the entire Mediterranean coastline into permafrost," Hermes said. "Also, she's heading this way, and she doesn't look stable." Right on cue, the throne room doors burst open with enough force to crack marble. There stood Demeter, radiating the kind of cold fury that made absolute zero look toasty. Every potted plant in the vicinity immediately decided to retire. "Where," she said in a voice that could freeze helium, "is my daughter? Zeus, king of the gods, lord of the sky, most powerful deity in existence, did what any wise immortal would do. He tried to hide behind his throne. Back in the underworld, Hades and Persephone had settled into what could only be described as the world's most unusual courtship. Currently, they were in his study, where Persephone had commandeered his desk to redesign the Elysian Fields layout. "The hero souls are getting bored," she explained, sketching rapidly. "They need more than eternal paradise. They need projects, purpose." She looked up at him with those eyes that saw straight through everything, like you do. Hades, who had been pretending not to hover anxiously nearby, moved closer to examine her plans. "You're suggesting we let them garden?" "Why not? They're heroes. They're used to improving the world," she grinned. "Besides, I've seen your attempts at landscaping. No offence, but eternal gloom isn't exactly a design style." "I thought the obsidian fountains were rather nice," he muttered, but he was already making notes in the margins of her sketch. This had become their pattern over the past few days. Persephone would spot something that could be improved, Hades would pretend to resist for about 30 seconds, and then they'd end up working together to implement her ideas. The underworld was starting to show signs of her influence. Luminous flowers blooming between crystal formations, comfortable reading nooks appearing in the library, even Cerberus sporting a new flower crown on all 3 heads. But it wasn't just the realm that was changing. Hades, who had spent millennia perfecting his brooding silence, found himself talking more than he had in centuries. Persephone asked questions, endless, insightful questions, about everything from his judicial system to his favourite scrolls to why exactly Charon insisted on that whole coin for passage thing. "It's a matter of principle," he explained one evening as they walked along the Styx. "Also, he's saving up for retirement." "Retirement? He's immortal!" "I've tried telling him that. He just mutters about compound interest and rows away." Persephone laughed, and Hades felt that now familiar warmth in his chest. He'd started measuring time differently, not by the endless procession of souls, but by the moments he could make her smile. They were touring the newly renovated Asphodel Meadows when a shade nervously approached with the latest reports from above ground. Hades read them, his face doing something complicated. "Your mother," he said carefully, "has apparently frozen the Mediterranean." Persephone peered over his arm at the report. "Only the coastline," she pointed out helpfully. "She's showing remarkable restraint. She's systematically destroying all plant life on Earth." "Yes, but she's doing it very thoroughly. Mother hates sloppy work." Persephone's light tone faltered slightly. "I should probably feel worse about this." Hades looked at her, really looked at her. Do you want to go back?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken things. This was his chance to be noble, to do the right thing, to be the kind of god who didn't solve his relationship problems with felony kidnapping. Persephone met his gaze. "Do you want me to?" "No," he said, the word escaping before he could stop it. Then, more quietly, "But I want you to have a choice. Real choice, not just accepting what someone else decided for you. Even if that someone is me." Back on Olympus, the emergency meeting had devolved into what immortal historians would later politely term a heated family discussion. Less polite observers would call it a divine disaster. Demeter stood in the centre of the throne room, her presence turning Zeus's carefully climate-controlled paradise into something resembling a prehistoric ice age. The marble floors frosted beneath her feet, spreading outward like a very passive-aggressive ink blot test. "Let me be perfectly clear," she said, in a voice that could freeze fire. "My daughter has vanished. The earth split open like a badly written metaphor, and none of you." Here she swept her gaze across the assembled gods, each of whom suddenly found the ceiling fascinating. "Know anything about it?" Zeus, demonstrating the leadership skills that had made him king of the gods, was trying very hard to become one with his throne. "Now, sister," he began, using his most diplomatic tone, "I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation." "Reasonable?" The temperature dropped another 20 degrees. "Reasonable? My daughter is gone. The ground ate her like a snack, and you want to talk about reasonable?" Aphrodite, who had been uncharacteristically quiet until now, cleared her throat. "Well, actually..." Artemis stomped on her foot, hard. "Actually what?" Demeter's head snapped around. "Actually," Aphrodite continued, rubbing her foot and shooting Artemis a betrayed look, "I think it's sweet. Dark, brooding lord of the underworld, beautiful spring goddess. It's very romantic." The silence that followed was the kind that makes black holes seem chatty. "Romantic," Demeter repeated, her voice dripping icicles. "You think this is romantic?" "Well, the dramatic entrance was a bit much," Aphrodite admitted, warming to her topic despite the rapidly dropping temperature. "But you have to admit, they do complement each other. Light and dark, life and death, spring and..." "You knew about this?" Every plant on Olympus simultaneously decided to go extinct. Several minor gods tried to hide behind each other. Zeus attempted to slide under his throne, but found it had frozen to the floor. "I might have helped things along," Aphrodite said, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "Just a tiny push, a subtle nudge. Really, they did most of the work themselves. The longing glances, the secret pining. Hades has been watching her for months, you know, writing poetry. Bad poetry, but still." "Months?" "Oh, yes. All very respectful, mind you. Lots of metaphors about light in darkness and hope blooming in desolate places. Actually, I have one here somewhere." She started rummaging through her robes. Hermes, showing more wisdom than usual, interrupted. "Perhaps we should focus on the current situation." "Yes," Demeter said, her voice arctic. "Let's focus on how I'm going to tear the earth apart until I find my daughter, and then we can discuss which of you is getting turned into fertilizer first." Zeus finally found his backbone, or at least a reasonable facsimile. "Now see here, we can't just have you destroying the entire world. The mortals are already confused enough about the whole winter thing. Watch me. Demeter, be reasonable." "Reasonable died when my daughter disappeared into a hole in the ground," she whirled on Zeus. "And don't think I don't know who had to approve this little arrangement. Only the king of gods could authorize something this monumentally stupid." Zeus's attempt at dignified denial was somewhat undermined by his nervous hiccup. That is, there were forms filled out." "Forms?" While Olympus was having its nuclear winter meltdown, Hades and Persephone were having what could generously be called a working dinner. Less generously, they were completely redesigning the afterlife administration system while picking at pomegranate seeds and arguing about filing methods. "I'm just saying," Persephone insisted, waving a seed for emphasis. "Categorizing souls purely by moral alignment is reductive. People are more complicated than good or bad, or did that one really heroic thing that one time." Hades, who had long since given up maintaining his mysterious Lord of the Dead persona around her, was making notes with one hand and absent-mindedly petting Cerberus with the other. All three heads were snoring gently, drooling shadow stuff onto his expensive sandals. The current system has worked for millennia, he pointed out, but his tone suggested he was already mentally redesigning everything. The current system put that one philosopher in Elysium just because he died dramatically. He's been arguing with the hero souls about the nature of reality for 3 centuries. They're heroes, Hades. They're not equipped for epistemological debates. Is that why Achilles requested a transfer to guard duty? He said, and I quote, "I would rather fight the Hydra again than listen to one more lecture about whether his spear really exists." Hades tried not to smile and failed spectacularly. This happened a lot around Persephone lately, these unexpected moments of humour cracking through his carefully maintained facade like flowers through stone. You're suggesting we reorganise the entire afterlife based on compatibility and interests, skills, what they actually want to do with eternity. She leaned forward, eyes bright with enthusiasm. Think about it. Philosophers with philosophers, warriors with warriors, artists creating eternal masterpieces. We could make whole new sections, and the really interesting souls, the ones who don't fit just one category, they could move between regions, cross-pollinate ideas. Hades watched her gesture animatedly, dropping pomegranate seeds everywhere in her excitement. She'd stopped looking like a kidnapping victim somewhere around day 3, when she'd marched into his throne room with a 15-point plan to improve shade morale. Now she looked at home. The thought made something warm and terrifying flutter in his chest. "You keep saying we," he said quietly. Persephone paused mid-gesture. "Oh." A slight blush coloured her cheeks. "I suppose I do." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Above them, the crystal chandeliers chimed softly in a non-existent breeze. Even Cerberus held his 3 breaths. Finally, Hades cleared his throat. "Your mother is freezing the world." "I know." "The mortals are panicking." "They'll adapt. Mortals are good at that." "Zeus is probably having an aneurysm." "Zeus gets what Zeus deserves." She set down her pomegranate, suddenly serious. "Are you trying to talk me into leaving or talk yourself into letting me stay?" Hades, Lord of the Dead, Master of Shadows, King of the Underworld, fidgeted. Actually fidgeted. Several nearby shades pretended not to notice, though they'd definitely be gossiping about it later. "I'm trying," he said carefully, just to do the right thing. He paused. "I'm not entirely sure what that is anymore." Persephone set down her pomegranate with the kind of deliberate care that suggested she was about to say something important. "The right thing according to whom? My mother, who thinks I need eternal supervision? Zeus, who approved your kidnapping because it was properly filed in triplicate? Or maybe according to you, who spent the last week pretending you're not watching to see if I'm happy here?" Hades went very still. "Am I that obvious? You reorganised the entire library because I mentioned liking poetry. You've been introducing me as Lady Persephone to all the shades and then looking terrified about it afterward. And yesterday you spent 3 hours helping me design a garden of luminous crystals, even though I know you think gardens should be dignified and restrained." "The crystals do add a certain ambiance," he admitted. "Hades." She reached across the table and took his hand. His skin was cool like marble in shadow, but it warmed under her touch. "Stop trying to be noble. It doesn't suit you." He looked at their joined hands. "I'm the Lord of the Dead. Being noble is sort of expected." "No, you're the god who built a functioning bureaucracy out of chaos, who judges souls fairly regardless of their earthly status, and who just spent 20 minutes arguing with me about filing systems." Her lips curved in a smile. "You're not noble, you're practical. So be practical now. What do you want?" "I want..." He stopped, started again. "I want you to stay here with me, running this realm together, arguing about soul categorization and garden designs and whether Charon needs an accounting department." The words tumbled out faster now, like he couldn't hold them back. I want to see what other ideas you have for improving the afterlife. I want to watch you charm Cerberus into wearing flower crowns and convince the Furies to take vacation days. I want you to choose this. Choose me. Not because I stole you, not because it's proper or expected or written in some divine law, but because you want to. Persephone was quiet for a long moment. Above them, the crystal chandeliers tinkled softly, casting rainbow shadows across her face. And if I do choose this, choose you, what then? Then we deal with your mother, together. We negotiate terms, establish boundaries, figure out a way to balance both realms. His thumb traced patterns on her palm. I'm good at contracts. We can make this work, if that's what you want. She looked at their joined hands, at the way shadow and light played across their intertwined fingers. You know, she said thoughtfully, most men would have just asked me to dinner first. I panicked, he admitted. You were standing there in the sunlight, and I just panicked. Persephone laughed, the sound echoing through the halls of the underworld like music. Well then, she said, reaching for the pomegranate, I suppose we should make it official. Wait. Hades caught her hand before she could take another seed. Before you do this, you should know what it means, really means. Persephone raised an eyebrow. You mean how eating the food of the underworld binds me here? I did read the employee handbook, you know. What? The giant tome in your library labelled Rules and Regulations of the Underworld. Very thorough. Excellent section on pomegranate-related binding contracts. Her eyes sparkled. Did you think I spent all that time in your library just admiring the architecture? For perhaps the first time in his immortal existence, Hades looked completely blindsided. You've been researching? Of course I have. One of us should know what they're doing, she squeezed his hand. 6 seeds, 6 months. Half the year here, half above. A perfect balance. Your mother. We'll have to accept that I'm not her little flower anymore. Persephone's voice was firm. I love her, but I'm not going back to being her carefully tended garden. I found something here. Something real. She lifted the pomegranate, its seeds gleaming like tiny rubies. So, Lord of the Dead, shall we negotiate terms? Above ground, at that exact moment, Demeter was in the process of creating the world's first blizzard when she felt it. The subtle shift in divine power that meant her daughter had just done something irreversible. The snow around her turned to hail. On Olympus, Zeus suddenly sat up straighter on his throne, sensing a contract being sealed. Oh, he said, with the tone of someone realising they're about to have a much bigger problem. Oh, no! But in the underworld, Persephone was counting out pomegranate seeds, with the precision of someone signing their name to destiny. 1 for spring, she said, consuming the first seed. 1 for winter, another seed. 1 for light, 1 for shadow. Hades watched, transfixed, as she continued her count. With each seed he could feel the magic taking hold, weaving them together in ways that even Zeus couldn't undo. And the last 2, she said, holding them up, for choice, for balance. She smiled. For us. As she consumed the final seeds, the entire underworld seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, impossibly, flowers began blooming in the throne room. Not the pale, ghostly blooms of before, but vibrant crystals that grew like living things, casting rainbow light across the dark walls. Well, Persephone said, looking around at her handiwork, that's going to take some explaining to the maintenance shades. Hades laughed, actually laughed, and pulled her close. I think, he said, we have more immediate concerns, like explaining to your mother why her daughter just became Queen of the Underworld. Queen of the Underworld, she repeated, testing the title. I like it, though we should really workshop the branding. Queen of the Dead sounds so last millennium. Persephone? Yes, mother first. Administrative reforms later. She straightened his crown, which had gone slightly askew. Don't worry, I have a plan. Does it involve more reorganisation charts? Obviously, she grinned. Now shall we go explain to the goddess of eternal spring why winter isn't actually the worst thing that could happen to the world? The confrontation between the newly minted royal couple and Demeter took place, appropriately enough, at twilight. That thin space between light and shadow where neither party had the home field advantage. They emerged from the earth far more elegantly than their first descent, though several nearby trees still fainted from shock. Persephone stepped out first, wearing her new crown of crystal flowers and shadow like she'd been born to it. Hades followed, looking simultaneously terrified and determined, the expression of someone who had faced down titans but found angry mothers-in-law substantially more daunting. The world around them was, well, winter wonderland would be putting it kindly. Apocalyptic ice age might be more accurate. Frost covered everything in sight and the air was so cold it practically crunched. "Mother," Persephone called out, "we need to talk." The blizzard that had been raging across 3 continents suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, Persephone. The ground trembled, the ice cracked, and there was Demeter materializing like a force of nature, radiating enough maternal fury to melt glaciers if she hadn't been the one creating them. She took one look at her daughter's crown, at her joined hands with Hades, and the temperature dropped another 50 degrees. "You," she said to Hades in a voice that could freeze fire, "you dare!" "Mother," Persephone interrupted firmly, "I ate the seeds." Demeter went very, very still. "You... what?" 6 of them, quite deliberately, with a side of administrative restructuring and employee benefits reform. You... what?" "Also, we're modernising the filing system and implementing a new souls classification matrix." Persephone's grip on Hades' hand tightened, but that's not really relevant right now. Hades, showing either tremendous courage or a complete lack of self-preservation, cleared his throat. "Lady Demeter, I should explain..." "Explain?" Demeter's voice could have frozen the sticks. "Explain how you stole my daughter? Explain how you tricked her into..." "He didn't trick me into anything," Persephone cut in. "Mother, I chose this. I chose him. And before you create another ice age, maybe we could discuss this like rational, immortal beings." "Rational?" Demeter's laugh could have shattered icebergs. "You want rational? Let's rationally discuss how my daughter vanished into the earth, how the Lord of the Dead, who apparently can't write a proper courtship letter but can file kidnapping permits, stole you away, and how you've somehow ended up wearing a crown that looks like it was designed by depressed architecture students." "I designed this crown, actually," Persephone said mildly. "The crystals are quite innovative. They grow in darkness but reflect light. Rather like me, don't you think?" Hades shot her a look that clearly said, "Maybe don't antagonize the goddess currently freezing the known world." "And as for the kidnapping," Persephone continued, ignoring his silent plea, "yes, it was dramatic and poorly planned and honestly a bit extra." "I was nervous," Hades muttered. "But," she pressed on, "it led to something important. Mother, when was the last time you asked me what I wanted?" That brought Demeter up short. The swirling snow around them slowed slightly. I gave you everything. Safety, eternal spring, protection." "Protection from what, Mother? From life? From change? From making my own choices?" Persephone's voice softened. "From love? Love?" Demeter looked at Hades like he was something she'd found stuck to her sandal. "He's the Lord of the Dead." "He's also surprisingly good at organisational reform," Persephone said. "And he listens to my ideas, all of them, even the ones about giving Cerberus a spa day." "We're still negotiating that one," Hades added helpfully, then immediately regretted speaking when Demeter's glare turned his way. 6 months, Persephone said firmly. "That's the deal. 6 seeds, 6 months. Half the year with him, half with you. Balance, Mother. Like all things should have." "Half?" Demeter's voice cracked slightly. "You expect me to just share you with him?" "No, Mother. I expect you to respect my choice. My first real choice." Persephone stepped forward, still holding Hades' hand but reaching for her mother with the other. The world needs winter sometimes. Time to rest, to reflect, to go inside and become something new, just like I needed this. Needed to become something more than just your daughter. The ice around them began to thaw just slightly. Demeter looked at her daughter, really looked at her. Perhaps for the first time. Gone was the carefree girl who picked flowers in endless summer. In her place stood a queen, one who had found her own power in the shadows. "And if I refuse?" Demeter asked, but her voice had lost some of its frost. "Then I stay below," Persephone said simply, "permanently, and the world stays winter forever. Is that what you want?" A long moment passed. The fate of seasons, of growth and decay, of balance itself hung in the balance. Finally Demeter spoke. "Does he at least feed you properly down there?" "Well," Persephone said, a hint of amusement in her voice, "the cafeteria situation needs work, but I'm implementing changes, starting with adding actual vegetables to the menu. Did you know they were just serving different types of darkness?" "Nutritional darkness," Hades defended weakly. "Very fortifying." Demeter's eye roll could have shifted continental plates. "My daughter, Queen of the Underworld, reforming the death deity's lunch menu. This is not how I imagined your future." "No," Persephone agreed. "You imagined me staying eternally young, eternally safe, eternally unchanged." She gestured at the frozen world around them. "But nothing should stay the same forever, Mother. Even the earth needs seasons." A warm breeze, the first in what felt like ages, stirred around them. Demeter looked at her daughter's crown again, at the way shadow and light played through its crystals, at how it suited her in a way flower wreaths never quite had. "You're happy?" she asked finally, her voice small. "Truly happy? Not just making the best of a kidnapping?" "Mother, I reorganized his entire kingdom within a week. I gave the Furies a vacation schedule. I'm implementing a reward system for the ferryman." Persephone smiled. "I'm not making the best of anything. I'm making it mine." Hades, who had been trying very hard to become one with the shadows, suddenly found himself the focus of Demeter's razor-sharp attention. "And you," she said, in a tone that suggested she hadn't entirely ruled out turning him into mulch. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Hades straightened, meeting her gaze directly. "Only that I love her," he said simply. "Not for her power over spring, not for what she can add to my kingdom, though she's already made it better than I ever could. I love her for her mind, her strength, her ability to see beauty in the darkest places." He paused. "Also, she's terrifyingly good at administrative reform." A snort of surprised laughter escaped Demeter. The sound seemed to shock even her, and the last of the killing frost began to recede. 6 months, she said finally. "Half the year above, half below, and I want visiting rights." "Of course," Persephone agreed quickly. "Though maybe we could set up a schedule with appropriate boundaries, because showing up unannounced in the underworld tends to startle the shades, and their paperwork gets everywhere when they panic." "Already protecting your subjects," Demeter murmured, and there was something like pride mixing with the resignation in her voice. "Very well, we'll negotiate terms." "Excellent," Persephone beamed. "I have some charts prepared." "Of course you do," Hades muttered fondly. "And I'm thinking we could establish a proper transition period between seasons. Maybe even set up some cross-realm agricultural initiatives. I have ideas about crystal gardens that could revolutionize both domains." As Persephone launched into her proposals, Demeter and Hades found themselves sharing a look of bewildered admiration. The world around them slowly began to find its balance. Not quite spring anymore, but not the deadly winter of before. Something new, something in between. And that's how the seasons were born. Not just from loss and grief, but from choice and change and compromise. From a daughter growing beyond her mother's garden. From darkness learning to nurture light. From love finding its way in unexpected places. Though if you ask the shades who work in the underworld's administrative offices, they'll tell you it's also the story of how they got their first proper benefits package and annual performance reviews. But that's a tale for another night. Now let's turn our attention to an ancient Egyptian tale. One about a goose who laid an egg that was the world. In the beginning, before there was beginning, there was only none, the endless primordial waters of chaos. And upon these waters floated a divine goose, who would come to be known as the Great Cackler. But she was not entirely alone in her task of creating the world, for in the potential of creation waited several beings who would become the fundamental forces of existence. Geb, who would become the earth itself. Nut, who would become the sky. Shu, who would become the air. And Tefnut, who would become moisture. The most patient of these waiting forces was Geb. He existed in that strange state between being and becoming, a consciousness that knew it would one day be the very ground upon which all life would walk. He would become the fertile black land along the Nile, the harsh red deserts, the rolling hills and hidden valleys. He would be both the earth that grew the grain and the depths that held the dead. But for now he watched as the great cackler fretted over her cosmic egg, the golden vessel that contained all these possibilities. "You know," he said, his voice like stone grinding against stone, "I can feel them all in there. My future self. Nut. All of us. Everything waiting to be." The goose adjusted her position atop the egg. "Oh? And how does it feel, being stuffed into an egg with all of creation?" "Cosy," Geb replied with what might have been a smirk, though it's hard to tell when your features are made of proto-mountains. "Though I do wish Shu would stop elbowing me, or what will become elbows. It's all rather metaphysical at the moment." "Well, you try fitting all of existence into one egg," Great Cackler said defensively. "It's not exactly like laying a normal egg, you know. There's the whole matter of ordering things properly." "Oh?" Geb's features shifted like continental drift. "And what's your plan for that?" "Well," she began, warming to her subject. "First there needs to be light, obviously. Can't have everything bumping around in the dark. Then separation, sky from earth, water from land. Which means..." She paused, looking at him apologetically. "You and Nut will have to be pulled apart." "Ah," Geb's voice held the weight of future mountains. "I had wondered about that. We're quite close in here." Indeed, even now in their potential state, Geb and Nut were intertwined like lovers in the cosmic egg. Earth and sky pressed together in perfect union. "It's necessary," the goose said gently, "for there to be space, for things to grow, for humans to exist. You two will need to be separated. Shu, the air, will hold Nut above you." Geb was quiet for a moment, and somewhere in the darkness thunder rolled. Will I ever touch her again? The great cackler's heart, which would soon help set the rhythm of all creation, ached a little. Your love will create mountains trying to reach her. Her tears will fall as rain to touch your face. And between you, she patted the egg meaningfully, between you, everything else will live. Everything else, Geb mused, his voice holding the first echoes of valleys yet to be formed. Tell me about them, these living things that will need the space between us. The great cackler settled more comfortably on her egg, her golden feathers shimmering. Well, there will be the sun god Ra, sailing across Nut's body each day in his boat, and in the dark hours he'll travel through your depths, through the duat beneath the earth. Sailing through me? How undignified, Geb grumbled, but there was fondness in his tone. Then there will be plants, thousands upon thousands of them. They'll root in your soil but reach for Nut's realm. Green things, growing things, stretching between earth and sky like children trying to touch both parents at once. A soft rumble, like distant earthquakes waiting to happen, suggested Geb liked this idea. And humans, the goose continued. Oh, the humans. They'll build great monuments on your back, trying to reach the sky. They'll study the stars in Nut's body and plant seeds in your soil. They'll tell stories about you both, about how your love was so great that even separation couldn't truly part you. Stories? Now Geb's interest was truly piqued. They'll remember us, remember you. They'll write songs about you, paint your images on temple walls, name their children after you. They'll see your love story played out every day, the earth and sky, separated but forever reaching for each other. The waters of Nun rippled with Geb's contemplation. And you think this is worth it? Worth the separation? The great cackler looked down at her egg, feeling all the potential stirring within. Creation always requires sacrifice, she said softly. But from your sacrifice will come everything else. Your love won't end, it will transform, become the force that holds the world together even as it keeps you apart. The waters of Noon began to stir more urgently now. The cosmic egg beneath the great cackler pulsed with golden light, and she could feel the forces within growing restless. Nut shifting like galaxies about to be born, Shu and Tefnut swirling like storm fronts, and Geb's presence becoming more solid, more Earth-like with each moment. "It's time, isn't it?" Geb asked, his voice now holding the weight of all the stone and soil he would become. The great cackler nodded. "The egg is ready. Everything inside is organised, as much as it can be. Geb," she paused, looking at the proto-deity with compassion, "are you ready to say goodbye to Nut? At least in this form?" Before Geb could answer, a new voice joined them, like starlight made sound, like the whisper of distant constellations. "My love," Nut's voice emerged from within the egg. "We knew this moment would come." The waters around them shimmered as Nut's potential form became briefly visible. A woman's shape made of night sky and scattered stars, still intertwined with Geb's earthen form. "The great cackler speaks truth," Nut continued. "Our separation will create the space where all life can flourish. Our love will become the force that maintains Mayat, the balance and order of all things." The egg pulsed brighter, and the great cackler could feel the moment of creation approaching like an immense wave about to break. The great cackler rose from the waters of Noon, her golden feathers blazing with inner light. The cosmic egg beneath her thrummed with power, each pulse sending ripples across the primordial waters. "My children," she said, her voice carrying the weight of all that was about to be, "it begins." And with that she let out the first sound of creation, not the mighty roar that some might expect, but a perfect resonant honk that rang through the void. The cosmic egg cracked. Light exploded outward, the first light, raw and new and blinding. Within it, forms began to take shape. Nut's body stretched upward, her skin becoming the dark velvet of space, stars sprouting like jewels across her flesh. Her arms and legs extended to the corners of existence, her back arching to form the dome of the sky. Geb's form solidified downward, flesh becoming soil, bones turning to stone, hair transforming into plants and trees. His body formed mountains and valleys, deserts and fertile plains. Between them, Shu rose like a mighty wind, his form both visible and invisible, pushing upward with the strength of all the atmosphere. His hands pressed against Nut's star-strewn belly, his feet planted firmly on Geb's earthen back, separating the lovers with gentle but irresistible force. Geb cried out, a sound like mountains breaking, reaching for Nut with hands that became great cliffs straining skyward. Nut reached back, her tears falling as the first rain, but Shu's separation was final and necessary. The great cackler watched as Tefnut spread moisture through the air, as Ra emerged blazing from the chaos to begin his first journey across the sky, as the spaces between earth and heaven filled with air and light and possibility. "It is done," she announced, her voice carrying through the newly formed world. "And it is. It is—" The great cackler paused, tilting her head to observe her handiwork from every angle. "It is absolutely, completely, utterly—" Thunder rumbled nervously. The new stars in Nut's body flickered with anticipation. Geb's surface trembled slightly. "Magnificent," she finished with a satisfied honk. And it was. The separation of Geb and Nut had created perfect balance. The vault of heaven above, the solid earth below, and between them all the space where life could flourish. Already the first green shoots were sprouting from Geb's skin, reaching toward Nut's starry form. Ra's first journey across the sky was painting the world in colours that had never existed before. Though, she added thoughtfully, the hippos might still be a bit too aggressive, but that adds character. From his position below, Geb let out a laugh that shook the newly formed mountains. Only you would create the entire universe and then worry about hippopotamus temperament. Well, somebody has to think about these things, she said primly, settling herself on a newly formed cloud. Speaking of which, she turned to Nut, whose star-speckled form arched overhead. My dear, are you comfortable up there? I can have Shu adjust his grip if the atmosphere feels too tight. Nut's laugh tinkled like falling stars. I am as I should be, though... Her gaze softened as she looked down at Geb. I will miss being closer. But look what your separation has created, the great cackler said gently, gesturing to the space between them where life was already beginning to stir. Your love didn't end. It transformed. Now it holds the whole world together. And it was true. Between earth and sky, desert and stars, the world had found its shape. Geb's mountains would forever reach for Nut's stars, and her rain would forever fall to touch his face. Their separation created the space for all other stories to unfold. Besides, the great cackler added, with a mischievous glint in her eye, I made sure to add a few special touches. Watch what happens when the sun sets. And so began the first day of everything, watched over by a rather pleased Goose who had, quite literally, laid the foundations of the world. Though she still maintained that the hippos could have been a bit less temperamental. The end. Speaking of hippos, here's an Egyptian tale of how a hippopotamus created the first song. In the early days of creation, when the world was new and the air still carried the fresh scent of possibility, silence dominated the landscape. The only sounds were those that necessity demanded. The whisper of wind across golden dunes, the gentle lap of Nile waters against muddy banks, and the soft shifting of sand beneath the paws of newly created creatures. The morning air hung thick with lotus fragrance, but no bird song yet sweetened the dawn. In her divine palace, high above the mortal realm where the air shimmered with perpetual twilight, and the floors were crafted from polished moonbeams, the goddess of love, beauty, and joy paced restlessly. Hathor's footsteps made no sound on the celestial floors, which only added to her frustration. Even her jewellery, crafted from stars and dreams, moved in silence against her golden skin. The world below stretched out like an artist's unfinished canvas. The rich black soil of the Nile Valley contrasted sharply with the burning oranges and reds of the desert beyond, while the great river itself wound like a silver serpent through the land. Everything looked perfect, but to Hathor's senses it felt incomplete. The silence sat heavy as a tomb's air, stifling the joy that should have danced in every sunbeam. What's the point of having created such beauty, she lamented to Ra one morning, as the sun god prepared for his daily journey across the sky, if we can't properly celebrate it? The air around her shimmered with unspent energy, like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone. Ra, his solar bark already glowing with morning light, merely adjusted his sun disk, which was sitting slightly askew after a particularly long night, and suggested she might enjoy something more sedate, like cataloguing clouds or teaching jackals to heal. But divine discontent has a way of sparking creation. As Hathor drifted among the mortal realm, her bare feet skimming the surface of the Nile, she began to notice how different objects responded to touch. A hollow reed, when the wind blew across its open end, sighed like a lonely spirit. A dried gourd, accidentally knocked against a stone, produced a hollow bonk that echoed briefly before dissolving into the hungry silence. Each sound was like a drop of gold in a vast empty vault. She began collecting these sounds, capturing them in a magical sistrum she crafted during one particularly inspired evening. The instrument took form between her hands, woven from strands of starlight, dawn mist, and just a touch of chaos, borrowed from Set while he wasn't looking. It shimmered with potential, like a mirage that had somehow become solid. It was during the hottest part of the day, when even the desert wind held its breath and the lotus flowers dozed half-closed on the river's surface, that Hathor first noticed Taweret. The the great hippopotamus floated in a cool pocket of the Nile, where the water ran deep and green-blue like liquid jade. Unlike her kin, who simply wallowed in the refreshing depths, Taweret had developed a most unusual habit. But let us go back a bit. Long before she became known as the musical hippopotamus, Taweret had a secret. Unlike other divine hippopotami who were content to wallow in the sacred waters, she had spent countless hours watching the way the Nile itself created music. In the deepest parts of the river, where the waters ran ancient and wise, she would float motionless, her sensitive ears detecting the subtle songs of flowing water. The Nile, you see, had its own rhythm. During the flood season it played deep, rolling crescendos as the waters rose. In the dry season, it whispered secrets in delicate ripples. At dawn, when the first light touched the water's surface, tiny waves would tap against the riverbanks in patterns so subtle that only someone who had spent centuries listening would notice them. Taweret, being a protective goddess and surprisingly observant for a hippopotamus, had noticed something else fascinating. Each creature that lived in or near the Nile contributed its own tiny sound to the river's symphony. Fish would swish their tails in particular patterns when hunting or courting. Water insects would tap dance across the surface in surprisingly regular rhythms. Even the crocodiles, not generally known for their musical talents, would create intricate patterns of ripples with their scaled tails. But what truly set Taweret apart was her unique physical form. Being part hippopotamus, part crocodile, and part lioness gave her a peculiar advantage. Her diverse anatomy meant she could perceive sound in ways no other being could. Through her hippo aspects, she felt the deep vibrations of the river. Her crocodile elements sensed the subtle changes in water pressure that created rhythm. Her lioness parts gave her an acute sensitivity to the higher harmonics that most others missed entirely. She discovered her bubble-making talent quite by accident. One particularly hot afternoon, while trying to cool herself in a deep pool, she found that by controlling her breath in specific ways, she could create bubbles that mimicked the patterns she'd observed in the river's natural music. Her first attempts were clumsy, more spluttering than symphony, but over time she refined her technique. The other hippopotami thought she was rather odd, of course. Who ever heard of a hippopotamus trying to make music, they would grumble, going back to their conventional wallowing. But Taweret persisted, practicing in quiet backwaters and hidden coves, gradually developing her own unique style of aquatic composition. One day, while practicing a particularly complex bubble sequence, Taweret noticed something extraordinary. The fish around her had begun swimming in synchronized patterns, following her musical directions like an underwater corps de ballet. Small silver fish would dart in perfect time with her higher notes, while larger Nile perch would glide gracefully through her deeper tones. Even more surprisingly, she discovered that certain bubble combinations could influence the weather. A series of rapid-fire tiny bubbles might bring a cooling breeze across the water, while slow, deep bubble tones could calm a choppy river surface. Deep in her secluded river coves, where papyrus reeds swayed like an attentive audience, Taweret refined her art. She discovered that different-sized bubbles created different notes. Tiny bubbles made bright, tinkling sounds like scattered starlight, while large bubbles produced deep, resonant tones that reminded her of distant thunder. By mixing these together, she could create complex harmonies that rippled through the water. Her favourite practice spot was a hidden bend in the Nile where the acoustics were perfect. Here, the limestone cliffs created natural amplification, and the particular depth of the water enhanced certain frequencies. The spot was marked by a distinctive rock formation that local fishermen swore looked exactly like a musical note, though none of them could explain how they knew what a musical note looked like, since music hadn't been officially invented yet. Over time, she developed a remarkable level of control over her bubble making. She could create double streams of bubbles, each moving at different speeds, producing counter-melodies that would have made master composers weep, if there had been any composers yet. She learned to use her teeth as a kind of underwater percussion instrument, clicking them in rhythm with her bubble sequences. Her tail, when moved just so, could create perfect ripple patterns that added a visual element to her aquatic orchestra. So when Hathor finally discovered Tawaret's talent, it was a moment of divine synchronicity. From her partially submerged snout came bubbles, but not the random bursts one might expect from a drowsy hippopotamus. No, these bubbles rose in precise patterns, dancing through the water like strings of underwater pearls. Small ones followed large ones, creating rhythmic sequences that caught the sunlight and transformed it into tiny rainbow spheres before bursting at the surface. Pop, pop, pause, pop. The pattern repeated, as regular as Ra's journey across the sky. Pop, pop, pause, pop, pop. Each sequence more complex than the last, each burst of bubbles carrying a hint of something greater waiting to be discovered. The water around Tawaret's snout swirled with tiny eddies, creating intricate patterns that seemed to dance with the rhythm of the bubbles. Hathor, who had been floating listlessly above the river, leaving a trail of diminishing sparkles in her wake, as goddesses tend to do, felt the first stirring of something new. The air around her began to vibrate with possibility, like the moment before a storm breaks, but gentler, more melodic. She lowered her sistrum toward the water surface, its magical metal gleaming with reflected sunlight and captured starshine. As the bubbles rose through the instrument's delicate framework, something extraordinary happened. Each bubble, upon touching the enchanted metal, transformed its simple pop into pure crystalline notes that hung in the air like visible drops of sound. The first notes were hesitant, like newborn gazelles finding their legs. But as Tawaret, encouraged by this development, began creating more complex bubble patterns, the music grew bolder. High notes danced above deeper tones, creating harmonies that had never existed before in the history of creation. The air itself seemed to come alive. The scent of lotus flowers intensified, mixing with the rich aroma of river mud and the crisp desert breeze, as if even the smells of the world wanted to join this new sensation called music. The light changed too, appearing to pulse gently in rhythm with the sounds, creating patterns of shadow and radiance that danced across the water's surface. The first to respond were the birds, who had until then spent their days in frustrated silence, opening and closing their beaks without purpose. A small desert lark perched on a swaying reed tilted its head in curiosity. Then, as if receiving divine inspiration, which, in fact, it was, it opened its throat and added its voice to the emerging symphony. The sound was like liquid gold poured into the air, a perfect counterpoint to the sistrum's crystalline tones and the hippopotamus's deeper rhythms. Other birds joined in, each finding its own unique voice. Ibises contributed long, flowing notes that swooped and soared like their flight. Falcons added sharp, clear calls that pierced the growing melody like rays of sunlight through clouds. From the reeds, frogs began to add their voices, creating a rhythmic bass line that pulsed through the water and up the riverbank. Crickets, not to be outdone, discovered they could make sound by rubbing their legs together, adding a shimmering layer of percussion to the emerging orchestra. The commotion at the Nile soon drew the attention of other deities. Thoth arrived first, his ibis head tilted in scholarly curiosity. He immediately produced a blank papyrus scroll, which he apparently always carried, just in case something needed documenting, and began creating the world's first musical notation system. His hieroglyphs danced across the page, trying to capture the essence of sound in visual form. When standard symbols proved inadequate, he simply invented new ones, including a particularly clever glyph that somehow managed to depict the exact sound of a hippopotamus gargling in perfect pitch. Isis glided down from the sky in a shimmer of wings and starlight, bringing with her the scent of mystery and magic. At first, she observed with her usual analytical precision, but soon found herself swaying to the rhythm. When she finally opened her mouth to join in, her voice carried all the secrets of the universe wrapped in melody. Her first lyrics, scholars would later note, were actually complex magical formulae set to music, which explained why several nearby plants suddenly transformed into entirely new species and a few rocks began to dance. Set arrived in characteristic fashion, with a thunderous entrance that briefly disrupted the entire performance. But rather than his usual chaos, he found himself caught up in the rhythm. His storms became percussion instruments. Thunder provided the bass notes, while lightning created sharp, bright accents in the celestial symphony. The desert winds under his control began to whistle through rock formations, creating haunting melodies that echoed across the dunes. Anubis, usually preoccupied with his solemn duties, discovered that the hollow chambers of pyramids created remarkable acoustics. His experimental vocalizations in these sacred spaces gave birth to what would later be known as funeral dirges, though his early attempts were surprisingly upbeat for someone associated with death. The jackals in his service joined in, their howls adding an eerily beautiful descant to the growing composition. Bustes slinked onto the scene with feline grace, her eyes glowing with interest. She found that cats, under her divine influence, could purr in perfect harmony. Soon she had organised the first feline choir, though maintaining order among her musicians proved challenging, particularly when some decided that the middle of a performance was the perfect time for a bath. Ptah, the creator god, was inspired to craft the first physical instruments. His divine workshop, which normally produced tools and weapons, now rang with a different kind of creation. He shaped wood and metal into forms that could capture and release sound in new ways. The first harp emerged from his hands, its graceful curve reminiscent of the crescent moon. Its strings, spun from moonbeams and morning light, produced notes that could make flowers bloom out of season. When Hathor first ran her fingers across these strings, the resulting chord caused several nearby statues to briefly come to life and join the dancing. He created drums from stretched sunshine, a particularly difficult material to work with, and frames of celestial cedar. Each drumbeat echoed the heartbeat of creation itself, and if you listened carefully, you could hear the rhythm of the stars pulsing beneath the primary notes. Tawaret's bubble music sparked a revolution in divine instrument making, though the first attempts to replicate her underwater symphonies on land led to some rather amusing mishaps. Ptah, inspired by watching her bubble patterns, began experimenting with hollow reeds of different lengths. His first prototype, essentially a bundle of papyrus stems tied together, produced sounds remarkably similar to a startled goose having a sneezing fit. But it was the way Taweret controlled the size and speed of her bubbles that provided the key insight. She demonstrated how changing the pressure and size of the airflow could create different notes, showing this by blowing bubbles through reeds of varying widths she found along the riverbank. Each reed produced a distinctly different tone, creating an underwater scale that rippled through the river like liquid music. Thoth, ever the mathematician, began calculating the precise relationships between reed length, diameter, and the resulting notes. His earlier scrolls on the subject included complex diagrams showing airflow patterns that looked suspiciously like musical hippopotami. He discovered that doubling the length of a reed would lower the note by exactly 1 octave, though this discovery was nearly missed when a particularly enthusiastic demonstration sent his ibis headdress flying into the Nile. The breakthrough came during one of Tawaret's underwater concerts. She had positioned herself beneath a hollow reed that stretched from the riverbed to the surface. As she released her bubbles, they travelled up through the reed, creating a haunting whistle that caught everyone's attention. Ptah, who happened to be passing by, allegedly by coincidence, though some suspected he'd been secretly studying Tawaret's techniques for weeks, was struck by inspiration. Working through the night in his celestial workshop, Ptah created the first true flute. He used sacred sycamore wood, carefully hollowed out using techniques he'd learned from watching Tawaret's bubble patterns. The instrument was carved with protective symbols that seemed to dance and shift when the flute was played, though this may have been an unexpected side effect of using wood from a tree that had grown in Isis's magical garden. The first note played on this flute caused quite a stir. Several sleeping birds suddenly awoke and began singing in harmony. A nearby statue started swaying to an unheard rhythm, and a young scribe's hieroglyphs rearranged themselves into musical notation. The sound was so pure that it brought tears to the eyes of everyone present, though Ra later claimed he simply had some desert sand in his eye. And so music entered the world, born from the unlikely combination of a musical hippopotamus's bubbles, a goddess's restlessness, and the collective creativity of Egypt's divine pantheon. From that day forward, the world was never silent again. Birds greeted each dawn with song, winds played melody through the reeds, and even the smallest stream bubbled with rhythmic possibility. As for Taweret, she continued her underwater concerts, though now she had an appreciative audience. On quiet nights, if you listened carefully near certain bends in the Nile, you might still hear the echo of those first musical bubbles rising through the water, the sound of a hippopotamus goddess teaching the world to sing. Hathor kept the magical sistrum, using it to spread joy and music throughout creation. Sometimes, on festival nights when the moon is full, she can be seen dancing above the Nile, her sistrum catching starlight and transforming it into pure sound, while below, a certain hippopotamus accompanies her with perfectly timed bubbles. And that is how music came to be, through the unlikely partnership of a goddess who couldn't stand silence and a hippopotamus who couldn't help but sing.